Decompressed is an interactive webcomic based on Space Station 13, in the style of the likes of Problem Sleuth or Homestuck. It started in mid-2015, starring a staff assistant stuck in the station's prison rig and needing a way out. As the story progressed, the assistant would make friends, meet allies, and discover that a dark cult was operating on board the space station. While it had a good run, it was sadly abandoned in 2018. But that's not what this video is about. Decompressed Nuke Ops is a recently finished interactive webcomic based on Space Station 13. This time starring antagonists, this reboot of Decompressed follows 4 nuclear operatives as they attempt to detonate a bomb on Space Station 13, and is hands down my favourite piece of SS13 media. It's an incredible adaptation of the classic nuclear emergency game mode, and I've included a link to a webcomic in the description below if you want to check it out. This video contains minor plot spoilers regarding certain scenes early on in the narrative, and any major spoilers will be put behind a spoiler warning. Before I start this video, I'd like to give a brief summary on what Space Station 13 is for those who are unaware. Space Station 13, SS13 for short, is a free atmospheric simulator turned role-playing game where you play as a crew member on a space station who must perform his or her job, while others are antagonists whose objectives may threaten the crew. As Space Station 13 is also a role-playing game, you're also expected to act somewhat like a real person and interact with other players outside of just the game mechanics. While the presence of antagonists would make it sound similar to games like TTT or Among Us, the fun in SS13 comes from the sheer mechanical complexity and interactions between systems and players more than the antagonists themselves. Despite its ancient engine, awful UI and janky combat, the depth of SS13 is unlike anything I've played before or since. Perhaps my favourite thing about Decompressed is how it understands its source material so well. For a game with no cohesive vision and whose development is split across multiple separate communities to the point where there is no singular version of the game, Decompressed sure does capture its spirit well. Space Station 13's theming is a mishmash of science fiction, especially retro sci-fi, with direct references to franchises such as Star Trek and Alien, as well as general geek culture with things like D&D wizards and JoJo stands. Despite this, it somehow manages to feel unique, as if a mishmash of ideas somehow made a cohesive whole. And I think that's nowhere more apparent than in the game's setting, a hideously unsafe research station in a sector of space run by Nanotracen, an authoritarian yet negligent megacorporation. Because each crew member is player controlled, the balance of power still follows a chain of command in theory, but is brittle and subject to the whims of the crew, resulting in something far more anarchic than you'd expect from your regular corporate dystopia. The villains of the setting are the Syndicate, a union of rival corporations and other anti-Nanotracen factions who perform sabotage, subversion, and outright terrorism in order to topple the giant corporation. While the Syndicate are the bad guys due to the nature of the game, Nanotracen aren't the good guys either. A security officer may beat someone to death out of incompetence or out of malice, but he may end up on the wrong side of an airlock should the crew grow tired of his abuses. This chaotic amorality is the setting of Space Station 13. It is the status quo through and through. Through gameplay, it is normalised and presented in a neutral light. Nanotracen and the Syndicate are not good nor evil. They simply are. Decompressed stars a 4-man crew known as the Redshift Operators, whose goal is to blow up a space station located in the frontier sector and run by the company. The first few scenes are a relatively light-hearted introduction to the world of Decompressed, with a few action sequences, funny jokes and establishing moments for each of the characters. Red Giant is your typical gentle giant, as dumb as a sack of rocks but genuinely wants the best for everybody. Neutron is efficient and mostly silent, viewing the world through a lens of objectives to be completed. And White Dwarf is your first terrible original character, an edgy katana-wielding self-proclaimed ninja supposedly possessed by dark energies with zero self-awareness. Red Giant and Neutron take on more of a supporting role throughout Decompressed, and while White Dwarf gets some major development later on in the story, Red Dwarf, the leader, is the star of the show. Red Dwarf is an immediately striking character. From his first scene, his hatred of the company is made apparent and is his driving motivation, as if he is a manifestation of the Syndicate personified. He is quick to anger, he is loud, he is violent, and he has a fragile ego, but more than anything, he is political. Most of these traits would make someone insufferable in real life, but from a reader's perspective, Red Dwarf is compelling and even likeable. His frail ego and quick temper work well with the initial humorous tone, as Red Dwarf tries to keep up his facade of coolness and control, even while everything goes wrong around him. Meanwhile, his overt political extremism makes it very easy for him to drive the story forward, in terms of character conflict and also world building. This is nowhere more apparent than in the first proper conflict of the story, when Red Dwarf boards the AI satellite and encounters the Security is authority. No matter the server you're on, security has a reputation for being brutally authoritarian. This is embraced in Space Station 13 culture. Shitsec, short for shit security, is a phrase known far and wide. The Gulag is the second name for a prisoner labour camp on some servers. Police brutality is expected. When you give players power over others, they will use it for good or for bad. Decompressed's head of security is an embodiment of the authoritarian ideal. He sees the frontier at its breaking point and sees himself and his forces as the bulwark that barely holds back the grey tides of lawlessness. Obedience is a virtue. Obedience to the company. In a lot of ways, he is like Red Dwarf. Angry, violent, and driven by a political zeal. They differ only in their beliefs. This difference escalates to violence almost immediately after they meet, but ultimately ends in a stalemate, as the AI's first law kicks in and seals the head of security away. This wouldn't be the last time they clash either, with increasingly violent results. Although there is one other difference between the two. Unlike Red Dwarf and his crew, the head of security is not in charge of his. And as the fabric of society he intends to protect is pulled taut, so too is his leash. Also, just as an aside, the baby race sequence afterwards with the head of security stuck in the AI core is one of the funniest moments to me, just because of how accurate it is to the salty bad hunter stereotype who gets so butt mad when somebody else gets in their way. White Dwarf is interesting. As mentioned, she's an edgy ninja acting like somebody's bad OC. Her fights are actually really cool and are based on predicting these long, elaborate battle plans that then play out in real time. But she feels more like a caricature than a character, and she actually is to begin with. White Dwarf is a caricature of a high RP player. All these badass ideas for a character with no consistency, all these dreams of cool combat set pieces without the game skill to back it up and no real identity to call her own. When White Dwarf ends up in a sword fight with the chaplain, an honor-bound religious fanatic, she immediately loses her nerve and runs away. She starts doubting what she stands for and, despite this fiction she surrounded herself with, is genuinely lost. From this point onward, her arc is about finding out who she really is, discovering and redefining a now gone sense of identity. After getting her ass handed to her on a platter during another fight, there's this really nice moment when Neutron is patching her up. See, Neutron follows this rigid goal-oriented mindset, the verdant text, and White Dwarf starts asking all these questions about how it works and where Neutron's objectives come from. And Neutron essentially teaches her the mindset. The scene ends with Neutron telling her how she needs to extrapolate objectives from her identity, from who she is, to think how she wants the galaxy to be down to the smallest detail, and then create objectives to live by and further that goal. And the payoff near the end of the story is actually really beautiful. White Dwarf ceases to be a caricature, and instead becomes a loving embodiment of the type of stories that these higher roleplay servers can bring to Space Station 13. The author of Decompressed has explicitly stated that his work is intended as a love letter to Space Station 13, and it shows. So much love and care has been put into taking things from SS13 and extrapolating them into something more. Green text is what we call an antagonist winning, because they completed all their objectives, because the text that shows up is green. And Decompressed turns it into a whole way of thinking, and a legitimate character trait for Neutron. The same applies for a lot of the characters, they distill the essence of what makes their role unique and the mindset behind the players that play them, and then they expand upon that. The end result is a cast of varied and fleshed out characters, each with their own goals and motivations, setting up the character drama that makes the latter half of the story so captivating. Sure, the Redshift Ops want to blow up the station and the crew would rather they not do that, but it's the motives behind each crew member's opposition that sets each one of them apart. Everybody, the Redshift Operators included, have their own morals and sense of right and wrong. Red Giant believes in absolute pacifism, while Red Dwarf believes in violent extremism. The head of security is willing to die fighting and sacrifice lives if it means victory, while the research director is only interested in getting crew and research off the station in one piece. These ideals clash, sometimes violently, and paint a massive web of interpersonal relationships that define the course of the story. The following section contains minor thematic spoilers for the end of Decompressed. No major plot details will be revealed, but please skip to the following timestamp or the next chapter on YouTube if you do not wish to be spoiled. Each character's morals and ideals are present from the moment you meet them, but they are continuously refined throughout the story. Even though the captain is not an active participant in the plot for a good 2/3 of it, it's pretty clear what kind of man he is by the time of the climax. He works within the system, a conformist making compromises within the confines of the status quo in order to help those who serve him, even if it comes at his own expense. Likewise, Red Dwarf's hatred of the company is shown from the very beginning in a way that perfectly fits the universe, most of the time. But it's only when we get to the manifesto of egregorism at the tail end of the story that we truly see what Red Dwarf stands for and why he's so insistent on changing the status quo. Yet as he confronts his final trial with egregorist fervour, the captain's middle road approach turns out to be anything but conformism. His ideals, merely the other side of the same coin. I could talk all day about what I like about Decompressed, about how the unofficial company protocol guide is legitimately hilarious and has some great lore dumps, about how the CMO's introduction with his psychoparadigm is an incredible establishing moment, about that one scene on the bridge, you know the one. I'd go on non-stop if I did, and some things are best left experienced blind. Decompressed is a snapshot of the spirit of Space Station 13 and then some. I've got almost nothing but praise for the comic. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, I've linked it in the description for anybody who hasn't read it to give it a shot. This has been Kieran9, thank you for watching and until next time.